The land accepted the morning reluctantly, its breath slow and uneven, as though the night refused to loosen its grip on the plains. The horizon deepened from black to a muted gray, stretching across the vast emptiness without warmth, without promise. The sky hung low, heavy, uncertain. It held the stillness that came before a storm, the kind of stillness that pressed against the skin and whispered that the world was about to shift. A distant wind rose across the northern hills. It carried with it the faint, bitter scent of dying campfires, the cold crace of damp soil, and something less tangible, an omen of movement, of change. Even before footsteps touched the ground, the land sensed that its quiet routine would not survive the day. Along the narrow road leading toward the small town of Tinsley, a lone rider emerged from the fading shadows. Lacey Roper. Her outline formed slowly in the dimness, brittle and tense as if carved from the very stillness she passed through. Her horse moved with a careful cadence, hooves sinking softly into the packed dirt, mirroring the tight caution of the woman who guided it. Lacey rode as one who had spent too many miles fleeing rather than arriving. Her posture carried both discipline and exhaustion. Her hands steadied the reins with a precision shaped by necessity. With every rhythmic step, she attempted to outpace the echo of something following her, a shadow stretched long from another state, another life she had not truly escaped. She did not trust roads. Roads led to questions, to eyes that lingered too long, to past mistakes reborn. Still, she had no choice. Among all the places she could disappear into, Tinsley seemed small enough, quiet enough, unimportant enough to swallow her presence without notice, or so she hoped. As she neared the edge of town, the first thin rays of sunlight finally broke through the clouds. They touched the rooftops gently, slid over wooden porches and sun-faded signs, but even the light seemed cautious, as though the morning itself was afraid to fully enter this day. Lacey dismounted in front of an old general store. She meant only to gather supplies and learn where a traveler might stay for a few days. She wished to remain unseen, to leave no impression. Yet in towns like Tinsley, a stranger had nowhere to hide. A man stood near the threshold, broad-shouldered, weathered by work and solitude, with a carriage that suggested strength but an expression carved by loss. Ethan Coldwell, a rancher known around Tinsley for his distance from others, for a quiet that settled over him like dust on untouched shelves. He noticed her the way one notices a sudden shift in wind, a subtle awareness, unexpected but impossible to ignore. Something in her presence unsettled the stillness he had accepted as his life. He did not know why. Perhaps it was the guarded way she scanned the street before stepping forward, the tension in her jaw betraying the effort to remain composed. Perhaps it was the weariness that lay beneath her features, the kind that did not come from a single hard day but from years of fighting to stay ahead of something unseen. Or perhaps it was nothing so definable, only the instinct that her arrival meant the quiet rhythms of his days was about to falter. Lacey felt his gaze but avoided meeting it. Eyes had been following her for too long, and most had led to trouble. She kept her movements calm, methodical, trying to slip past him like a passing shadow, as though their paths had no reason to cross. But small towns rarely allowed such clean distance. Encounters that seemed accidental often became threads that bound lives together long before the people involved realized it. Ethan made no outward reaction, maintaining the appearance of indifference forged through habit. Yet somewhere deep within, something shifted. A question formed, unspoken but persistent. Who was she? What weight did she carry that made her shoulders so rigid against the morning breeze? As Lacey stepped away from the store and back onto the quiet street, a faint ripple of unease moved through her. She had not intended to be noticed. She had not intended for anyone to wonder about her. But the man's eyes had followed her, and she sensed that her arrival had already left a trace she could not erase. The day pressed forward, warming the ground and stirring life into the town. Doors opened, voices rose, dust drifted lazily in the air. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of morning lay a current of something fragile and new. Two lives had brushed against each other for the first time. No vows had been made, no choices had yet taken shape, but the path had already shifted beneath their feet. Invisible, inevitable, the first quiet pull of fate had begun its work. And neither of them, whether they sensed it or not, would be able to turn back.
The ranch of Ethan Caldwell lay apart from the road, as if trying not to remind the world of its existence. The house, built by his father back in the 1870s, stood on a small rise surrounded by wide fields and sparse pines clinging to the dry soil. Its walls seemed saturated with silence, as if too many years had passed since anyone had laughed inside them. Ethan had lived alone for 5 years, ever since the tragedy that claimed the life of his younger brother, Jonas. Since then, the house had become more like a shadow than a place inhabited by someone alive. He kept the ranch running out of habit, repairing fences, turning the horses out to pasture, mending sections of the roof when storms tore at the wood. Every movement in his routine carried a mechanical coldness, as if he were a man who continued breathing only because the body remembered how. The people of Tinsley no longer asked questions. To them, he was the quiet, distant man who had chosen solitude for himself. No one knew why he still held on to the ranch that brought him more sorrow than comfort. Perhaps it was the last remnant of family he could not abandon. Perhaps it was a punishment he had silently assigned himself. One morning, Lacey appeared again in town. She carried herself with slightly more certainty than the day before, yet her steps still revealed a carefulness that came from long months of caution. When she approached the general store to ask if there was work in the area, the old shopkeeper simply shook his head. Seasonal jobs were scarce, and the few that existed were already taken. So Lacey decided to try her luck with the ranchers who lived farther from town. She preferred not to linger in Tinsley, where curious eyes and casual questions could draw unwanted attention. She needed a place to hide, to become invisible. That search brought her to the gate of Ethan's ranch. Ethan noticed her immediately. It was his old border collie who first lifted its head and turned toward the road. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and recognized the figure approaching. Lacey moved with the same small, deliberate motions as before. She asked for work without words, through her posture, through the quiet steadiness in her eyes. She was not seeking comfort or kindness. She was looking for a place to stay, even temporarily, and was ready to earn it. Ethan sensed something familiar in her persistence, the same unseen thread of steel that had once kept him standing when life had begun to collapse. He did not press her with questions. He simply nodded, allowing her to remain and work in the stables. The first days passed in silence. Lacey woke before dawn, earlier than Ethan. She stepped into the yard and worked without pause, ignoring fatigue. Ethan observed her from a distance, noting the precision and strength in her movements. She behaved like someone fighting for a new start, someone who understood that survival depended on every small task she completed. Their paths crossed only in brief, muted moments. A shared glance near the water buckets, a brief nod when one stepped aside for the other. Then each returned to their work, as if both feared disturbing the fragile walls they carried inside themselves. Yet something began to grow quietly between them. Not attachment, not yet. Rather, a recognition, a subtle awareness, as if two people shaped by different lives could still sense the same wound in each other. Silence became their language. In the evenings, Ethan sat on the porch, watching the fields turn darker as night settled in, while Lacey remained near the stables, where the sounds of restless horses and distant coyotes soothed her more than words ever could. Though neither of them tried to draw closer, the house that had stood empty for years began to feel inhabited again. Carefully, cautiously, it absorbed the presence of another soul. The ranch seemed to breathe differently, as if remembering that life could return to places long abandoned by hope. And though they were still unaware of it, fate was already threading them together. The thread, thin at first and hardly noticeable, tightened with each passing day. Soon, it would be the only path either one of them could follow.
She sensed the shift long before she allowed herself to admit it. The air on the ranch felt different, heavier, as if the land itself warned of something approaching. Her past had always followed her like an unbroken shadow, stretching from town to town, waiting for the moment, pressing closer whenever she dared to slow down. She had learned to run not because she feared the world, but because she feared the man who once held her life like a rope around her neck. For weeks on the ranch, she had moved carefully, quietly, keeping her presence small, almost invisible. She worked from dawn until the last trace of daylight vanished, and in that rhythm she felt something close to safety. Ethan had sensed her caution but never questioned it. His silence had become a shelter she desperately needed, a space where she didn't have to explain the weight she carried. But the world beyond the ranch shifted. Whispers rose in town, carried by passing wagons and drifting through saloon doors. A stranger had arrived. A lone rider who moved with the certainty of someone who followed a trail only he could see. He asked about a woman without giving her name. His words were vague, but his intent clear enough. People in Tinsley talked, observed, remembered. It didn't take much to connect his descriptions to the quiet girl working on Ethan Caldwell's land. The first time the rumor reached her, the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The walls of the small room where she slept felt too close, the narrow bed suddenly suffocating. She realized she had been found again. It had happened before, always the same way. A man appearing out of nowhere, searching, closing in. Each time she escaped, leaving behind whatever semblance of life she had managed to build. Each time she believed she was one step ahead, and each time she was proven wrong. From that day on, she avoided town entirely. The paths she used became narrower, hidden. Her gaze turned constantly over her shoulder. Her hands, once steady in work, shook whenever she thought too long about the stranger. She breathed shallowly, moved faster, spoke even less than before. Her fear became a second skin, clinging to her even under the sun. Ethan watched her from a distance. He saw how she changed, how her confidence unraveled into something brittle. She moved as if expecting danger in every corner, as if a single mistake might reveal her to the world. He didn't know her story, didn't know the danger that stalked her footsteps, but he recognized the expression in her eyes, someone who had survived too much and expected the worst to return. As days passed, new signs appeared around the ranch. Unfamiliar hoof prints pressed deep into the dry earth. Someone on horseback had ridden dangerously close to the property, lingering long enough to study the land. The prints were fresh, the direction intentional. Ethan noted them silently, feeling a cold weight settle in his chest. One night, the unease became impossible to ignore. His dog, usually calm, growled low and steady as if sensing something unseen. When Ethan stepped onto the porch, the wind carried a sharper scent. Horse sweat, leather, the faint trace of someone who didn't belong. He scanned the northern ridge, the darkness thickening like a warning. Someone had approached the ranch under cover of night, cautious but determined. Inside the house, Lacey felt it as well. A heaviness pressed at the windows, a pressure against the walls, as if the night itself leaned in, listening. Her pulse quickened without reason, guided by instinct. The danger she had run from had crossed the final distance. Ethan understood without needing answers. The threat wasn't a possibility anymore. It had arrived, quiet and deliberate, waiting for the right moment to strike. The stranger searching for her had found what he wanted. The air around the ranch tightened, pulling both of them into the same unspoken realization. The time for hiding had ended. The past she feared had stepped on the same ground they lived on. Whatever came next would break the fragile quiet they had built, and neither of them could outrun what was coming.
The morning rose without birdsong or warmth, unfolding instead with the sharp tension that hung in the air like a thin veil ready to tear. Lacey woke before the first trace of light touched the horizon, her pulse already racing. Something had shifted outside. Something irreversible had crossed the boundary of the ranch. When she stepped into the yard, the faint glow of dawn revealed the marks she had dreaded to see. Heavy, deliberate hoofprints cut into the soil, deeper than any she had seen before. They had not been there the day prior. The man from her past had reached this place. He had stood here, close enough to see the outline of the house and the path she walked each day. She realized she had no time left. Escape had to happen now, before the sun fully rose, before danger stepped through the door. Her belongings were few, but she gathered them quickly with frantic precision, her breath uneven, her hands trembling as though her body moved ahead of her thoughts. She crossed the yard toward the stables with the single intention of leaving before anyone could try to stop her. But inside the dim light of the stable doorway, Ethan was already waiting. His posture was steady, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a depth that made her freeze where she stood. He had seen the tracks too. He had felt the shift in the air. He knew. Without a single question, without a word exchanged, he understood what she intended to do. Lacey tried to pass him, moving with the instinct of someone who had lived too long in flight, but he stepped into her path, not imposing himself by force, only by the sheer certainty of his presence. The quiet resolve in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He would not let her disappear into the horizon. He would not let her run into danger alone. He refused to allow her life to collapse again, just because the past had caught up. She felt the weight of that choice pressing against her ribs. The last thing she wanted was for him to be pulled into her darkness. She carried a history that was sharp enough to wound anyone who reached for her. But before she could take another step, he moved closer, not to restrain her, but to stand beside her, as though anchoring her to the ground she had spent so long trying to leave. As daylight faded, the storm she feared finally arrived. The stranger crossed onto the ranch with the confidence of someone who believed the land already belonged to him. He walked with slow, measured steps toward the house, his silhouette cutting through the darkness like a blade. He had hunted for so long that he recognized the end of the trail. Ethan stepped forward to meet him. His steps matched the stranger's pace, each inch closing the distance, a tension stretching between them like a wire ready to snap. Lacey stood in the shadows behind him, her breath shallow, her body stiff with dread. Fear twisted inside her, not for herself, but for the man who now placed himself between her and the life she had tried to outrun. What followed was not a clash of fists or a roar of threats, but something far quieter and far more devastating. It was a moment built on choice. Ethan faced the man from her past with the full weight of someone who had decided, fiercely and without hesitation, that she was worth protecting. He absorbed the danger she had carried with her for years, taking it as his own. His stance alone forced the stranger back, not in defeat, but in recognition that the woman he sought was no longer unguarded. When the stranger retreated into the darkness, leaving behind uncertainty and a promise of return, the night wrapped around the ranch with a new heaviness. But something within Lacey shifted as she watched Ethan. For the first time she saw him clearly, not as the quiet rancher who had given her work, not as the man who kept to his solitude, but as someone who had stepped willingly into the storm she carried. And for the first time in years, she felt something deeper than relief. She felt the unfamiliar weight of belonging. She realized that staying was no longer about fear or survival. It was about the quiet strength she found in him, the way his presence allowed her to breathe without watching every shadow. With him, she didn't have to run. She didn't have to hide. With him, she could finally live.
The night after the stranger's retreat settled over the ranch like a heavy shroud. Nothing moved except the shifting shadows cast by the lantern on the porch. Lacey barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the outline of the man who had come for her, the way he carried himself, the certainty in his steps. She understood his return was inevitable. Men like him never accepted defeat, never turned away from unfinished pursuit. The ranch felt too exposed now, too fragile in the vast emptiness of the Dakota Plains. Freedom had always demanded a price, but she had never imagined it would come to this. Ethan rose before dawn, not with the quiet routine of a man tending to his land, but with the weight of a decision pressing against his spine. He walked the perimeter of the property, scanning the ground, reading the land like a book written for men who understood danger. Fresh tracks led away into the hills. The stranger had not gone far. He had withdrawn only to observe, to wait for the perfect moment to strike where the ranch was weakest. When Lacey stepped outside, she found Ethan near the barn, studying the earth with a stillness that made her chest tighten. He didn't look at her, but she sensed the question in the rigid line of his shoulders. How far was she willing to go to reclaim her life? How much should he risk to protect her? People in the territory vanished every year because of old debts and buried secrets. The ground swallowed stories without leaving a trace. Throughout the day, the ranch moved as if bracing for a storm. The horses grew restless, pacing within their enclosures and lifting their heads at sounds too distant for human ears. Wind rolled over the plains in long, uneven breaths, carrying the faint smell of rain, even though the sky remained clear. Lacey felt it too, that unsettling pull inside her ribcage, the instinct that danger was no longer approaching, but circling. By late afternoon, she began to understand the depth of her own fear. It wasn't the fear of harm that rattled her. She had faced that before. What hollowed her out now was the fear of losing the small piece of life she had finally begun to build here. The stranger threatened more than her safety. He threatened her chance at a future shaped not by running, but by choosing to stay. As the sun dipped low, Ethan prepared the ranch for nightfall with the precision of someone who expected confrontation. He secured the gates, checked the locks, and led the horses into the sturdiest stalls. Lacey watched him from across the yard, noticing the quiet determination in every movement. He had no obligation to stand with her, yet he did so without hesitation. She felt a deep ache of gratitude that she had no words for. When the last light faded, silence fell again, heavier than before. Lacey sat inside the house, tracing the grain of the wood beneath her fingers, listening for the slightest change in the wind. She was no longer the girl who fled without looking back. She had grown harder edges, sharper instincts, but her heart remained vulnerable in ways she could not fully hide. She knew the stranger viewed vulnerability as opportunity. Hours passed. Somewhere in the distance, an owl cried, its call thin and forlorn. The sound carried across the fields and was swallowed by the dark. Lacey exhaled slowly, realizing that fear had fused with exhaustion, forming a numb stillness deep in her chest. She wondered how many times a person could rebuild themselves before the weight became unbearable. Outside, Ethan kept watch, his silhouette framed by moonlight.
He had positioned himself on the porch, where he could see both the open fields and the winding path leading toward town. He held no lantern, relying instead on his familiarity with the land. Every sound reached him clearly: the shifting of the wind, the faint rustle of dry grass, the long, slow breaths of the earth itself. Lacey stepped outside eventually, drawn by an invisible thread. She stood a short distance behind him, her presence quiet but unmistakable. He did not turn, yet she knew he sensed her there. The space between them carried meaning that neither of them had dared to name. In the absence of words, something stronger grew, something built not on promises, but on shared danger and unspoken understanding. The true cost of freedom had revealed itself tonight. It demanded more than escape. It demanded standing one's ground, claiming the right to live without fear. It demanded trust in someone who offered protection not out of duty, but out of choice. The wind shifted again, carrying a new sound, distant, faint, but unmistakable. The muffled thud of hooves, slow, intentional, moving toward the ranch. Lacey felt her heartbeat rise, her breath catching as reality settled like ice in her lungs. The stranger had returned, no longer content with circling from afar. He had chosen his moment. Ethan straightened, his posture firming into a silent readiness. The time for waiting had ended. Freedom, he knew, required confrontation, and he was prepared to pay the cost alongside her. The darkness around them deepened. The approaching rider moved closer, the rhythmic pulse of hooves growing clearer, heavier, carrying the promise of a reckoning neither of them could avoid. Lacey stood still, the plains stretching out behind her like an endless sea of shadows. She felt fear, she felt resolve, and she felt the fragile, powerful truth that she was no longer alone. The night held its breath, knowing that what came next would define the fate of them both.
Spring in South Dakota arrived with the quiet patience of something that never hurried. It moved across the open plains in slow, almost cautious steps, melting the last thin edges of snow and softening the frozen ground beneath. At first, the land only hinted at change, releasing a faint smell of thawing earth, a promise carried on cool morning winds. Then blades of early grass began to push through the brittle remains of last year's growth, each one a small, stubborn declaration that winter had finally loosened its grip. One morning, as the horizon held a pale shimmer of gold, Lacey stepped out onto the porch and felt the shift in the world before she even saw it. The air carried warmth instead of warning. The sky hung softer, almost tender. The hills breathed with a quiet pulse of renewal, as if they too were waking from a long, heavy sleep. Everything around her felt different in a way she couldn't quite name, but deeply understood. Ethan followed her outside a moment later. The man who stood behind her was no longer the one she had met at the beginning of autumn, worn down by years of solitude and unspoken burdens. Something in him had changed, in the slow, steady way seasons change. The emptiness in his eyes had faded, replaced by a calm certainty that settled across his features like morning light. The heaviness he once carried had lifted, leaving a quiet strength shaped by the months they had survived together. Lacey felt the same shift within herself. The shadows that had clung to her past no longer controlled her steps. The threat that once haunted her days had dissolved like mist evaporating over the prairie grass. What she had feared for so long had finally released its hold, allowing her to breathe in a way she never had before. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding.
she was choosing. The ranch was no longer a refuge born of necessity, but a home built from presence, effort, and shared days. Every repaired fence post, every cleared path, every evening spent by the quiet glow of lamplight had woven itself into something solid and lasting. She remained here not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this land, with its long winds and wide skies, had become the place where her life felt real. Ethan sensed this just as clearly. With her beside him, the silence that once filled the house no longer felt empty. His work had purpose again. His days carried weight. The routines of ranch life had shifted from survival to something steadier, something that hinted at a future built with patient hands instead of lonely endurance. They walked together across the property that morning, the thawed earth soft beneath their steps, the scent of spring rising slowly around them. Their plans were simple ones, yet held the depth of a shared life taking shape. They intended to finish rebuilding the old house, to expand the stables, to plant a new garden along the southern fence where the soil warmed faster. Each task was small on its own, but together they formed the outline of a future that neither of them had imagined months ago. The rising sun cast a wash of gold across the ranch, stretching long light across the fields and turning the distant hills into silhouettes of muted amber. Lacey and Ethan stood side by side, their shadows touching on the ground before them. In the quiet moment where morning met day, they both understood that something deeper had begun to unfold. Not a rescue, not a refuge, but a partnership shaped by truth, presence, and the quiet certainty that they had found something enduring in each other. The day opened before them like a fresh page, and the horizon no longer looked like a frontier to survive, but a place where new life waited. Together, they stepped forward, not as two people defined by their pasts, but as two souls who had learned to trust the steadiness they found in one another. The morning grew brighter around them, carrying with it the sense of a new beginning, rising slowly, steadily, and unmistakably.
And if you want to experience more stories like this, filled with depth, fate, and cinematic moments that stay with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel.